All right, let's get started.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to say thank you to everybody joining us, including, of course, our guest speakers. My name is Luisa. I'm a member of DSA, and I am part of the National Political Committee, as well as an anti-war, anti-imperialist activist based in the United States. I have the pleasure of facilitating this webinar. As you all probably know, today is the 75th anniversary of NATO's founding, and we're one of the dozens of organizations around the world marking the occasion to bring attention to this dangerous military alliance and its role as an arm of US-led imperialism. As socialists in the imperial core, it's important for us to understand military force used for the defense of capitalism and the exploitation of the global South in order to effectively oppose it. And that's part of what this webinar is about. So our next slide, we have two very special guests who will share their perspective on NATO's colonial legacy and its continued expansion and empowerment, what it means for the prospect of peace in this century. Pavel Vardin is the coordinator of the International Secretariat Progressive International and also a longtime anti-imperialist organizer, activist, and author. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of Code Pink. Very famously, she has worked as a social justice and anti-war activist for over 50 years and is an author of several books, including War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. So thank you both for joining us. Code Pink and Progressive International both do amazing work. I can say that DSA is officially a member of Progressive International, and please to look them up if you haven't already and consider joining their mailing list. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to give a brief history. So, and just to give some historical context to our discussion, leading to where NATO is today. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is a military and political alliance with nuclear weapons formed in 1947 between 13 primarily Western European countries, the United States and Canada. It was purposely created as a collective defense force to guard against external threats, mostly to undermine the spread of communism, and for the US to assert military, political, and economic predominance in Europe. The founders of NATO were the principal colonizers in Africa, and through the alliance, they undermined post-war decolonialization efforts by, among other things, stewarding the proliferation of military bases, including with apartheid South Africa, through clandestine operations and arms sales. Famously, despite a promise not to expand into former socialist republics during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO spread into 16 countries over the past 3 decades and now uses the war in Ukraine to justify further expansion. Despite its mandate to act in self-defense, NATO has been used to carry out belligerent military interventions, notably in Serbia and Montenegro in 1999 and Libya in 2011, where as a result, we've seen photos of open-air slavery, in defense of capitalism and Western strategic interests, including military expansion, regime change, market liberalization, and control over natural resources. After the September 11 attacks, the United States involved all 30 member states at a time in the 20-year war on terror in Afghanistan. Most recently, NATO's expansion played a key role in setting the stage for the war in Ukraine, which has brought us closer to nuclear destruction more than ever. Today, core NATO nations, the US and Germany, are actively supplying Israel in its massacre and starvation of Palestinians. And looking forward, NATO now explicitly names countering China as a strategic priority. Next slide. So now we are, just to give you a visual context, NATO partners, and you can even see Colombia on the map, not a full partner, but still part of it. So now we're going to turn to our speaker, Pavel, whenever you're ready.
So much, Luisa, and thank you for organizing this. I think it's really important that we keep talking about NATO. Some of you will know that we've called for a global day of action against NATO for today. And in fact, there are some actions that are taking place, including at military bases in Italy. I think some are taking place right now, actually, as we're having this webinar. But they're pretty small actions. And the response I got from a lot of organizations that I was speaking to was that it'll be very difficult to organize on anything other than Palestine right now. And I think that's absolutely right. I think Palestine has to be our core objective. I think stopping the genocide and, let's be frank, dismantling the Zionist entity that's perpetrating it has to be the focus of our movements. But I think NATO has to be a part of that conversation because NATO is inseparable from the genocide in Gaza. And I want to make that case today by expanding a little bit on some of what Louisa has already said. And maybe if you could turn back to the previous slide, that would be really helpful because I want to look back at some of the original founders of NATO. So, if we take this, if we go back to when NATO was founded and we look at the rationale that was given, and this is in fact, I think almost verbatim from the NATO website, the goal was to build a defensive alliance that can guard against Soviet expansionism. That term, Soviet expansionism, is used a lot in NATO literature. And it's an interesting term because if you look at the context in 1945, 1949, what expansionism are we talking about? The Soviet Union had just lost 27 million lives. It was heavily deindustrialized. It was severely weakened militarily. And if you look at Soviet foreign policy at the time, it was a lot less maybe interventionist than it might have been before the war. From an internationalist perspective, in the ways that it supported different movements around the world. So there was no real threat of Soviet expansionism. There was no risk that Soviet tanks would roll across, the Elbe and head towards France. So what was all this talk of Soviet expansionism really about? I think there are two things. There are two threats. One threat existed within Western Europe, and one threat emanated from the global South, and I'll say a little bit about both. In Western Europe, it's hard to imagine now, but because of the role that the Soviet Union had played in defeating Hitler, and the Soviet Union at the time was recognized as playing the dominant role in defeating Hitler, communism, the Soviet Union, and even Stalin held tremendous prestige with the people of Europe, including Western Europe. So the idea of a kind of, evil Soviet Union that's preparing to occupy our land wasn't really that current at the time. But not only that, if you look at the forces within Western European countries that mounted the most effective, sometimes the most heroic rebellions or acts of resistance against Nazism, they were the communists and they were the socialists, they were the partisans. Look at Greece, a particular example of heroism. You had the Greek partisans who fought both against the British Empire and against the Nazi German regime, which basically fought side by side to dismantle the Greek communist movement. You had really powerful partisan movements in France, in Spain, in Italy, and many other countries. And when the war ended, these movements, of course, had aspirations to represent the working classes of their countries and come to power, and they were hugely popular. And so the threat that emerged wasn't that the Soviet Union was going to send tanks to Italy or Greece. It was that communist parties, parties of liberatory movements were going to seize power in Western Europe, thereby foreclosing access for the United States to what is one of the most important geopolitical vectors. You have to remember that from the perspective of where I imagine all of you are sitting, or many of you are sitting, Europe is a gateway both to Eurasia, including Russia, China, the Middle East, or West Asia, and to Africa. So hugely important strategic site, and the US wouldn't have socialist or communist governments in power there. And I hope we get a chance later to talk a little bit more about the ways in which NATO operated to subvert the emergence of socialism and communism in Western Europe. But the other threat came from the global south. If you look at the founding members, the 12 founding countries, right? There was this big meeting. There was a round table, really sinister looking, kind of like in Doctor Strangelove. 12 representatives of 12 countries sat around the table and signed the founding document, the treaty that established NATO. Among them, as Luisa said, you had some of the biggest colonial powers in history, right? The main European colonizers. You had Belgium, you had France, you had Italy, you had Portugal, which at the time it signed the document, was led by a fascist dictatorship, the fascist regime of Antonio Salazar. You had the United Kingdom, and of course you had the United States, which you could say was a rising neo-colonial, colonial imperial state at the time. And again, if the threat of Soviet expansionism in 1949 is not something that we can take seriously, then what was the greatest threat to these countries? Well, it was basically the same, in its essence, the same threat that the US faced in Western Europe. It was the threat of liberation, right? It was the threat that anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements would rise up and sever their access to important trade routes, to important resources, to important markets, to sources of cheap labor, to all the privileges of colonial domination. If you read what some of the great anti-colonial freedom fighters wrote at the time, read Amilcar Cabral, who fought in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and other places. He wrote how in the course of a struggle, they found weapons from across all of the founding NATO member states, which were being sent to Portugal in order for Portugal to fight its wars of colonial domination against these rising anti-colonial struggles. And in fact, they said that if not for this collectivization of power through NATO, if Antonio Salazar's dictatorship wasn't pumped with weapons and training and money and other kinds of support, he wouldn't have been able to wage those wars as long as he did. Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, Walter Rodney, they wrote about the same thing. There were over a dozen military bases across North Africa, NATO military bases, including one nuclear testing site, which on one hand had launch systems aimed at the Soviet Union, but on the other hand had the capacity to penetrate deep into Africa to ensure that the precious resources, especially in the Sahel region and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, that were essential to the military-industrial complex, like uranium, cobalt, and other minerals and resources, would remain available to the old colonizers for the production of, the instruments of war. And again, there was a broad recognition that Africa was used as a pawn and effectively forced, as Walter Rodney wrote, to contribute to its own subordination, to its own subjugation by NATO powers. I happened a couple of years ago to visit the Sahara Desert in southern Algeria. Not many people know about this, but there is a colony in Africa. There is a part of Africa which is recognized officially by the United Nations as the last colony of Africa. It's called Western Sahara. It was basically ceded by Spain in 1975 to Morocco, which maintains an occupation today. And about half the Sahrawi population lives in the middle of this desert, this really inhospitable, inhabitable part of the Sahara Desert. And in that bit of the desert where they have 5 or so refugee camps, they have a museum called the Museum of Resistance. And when you go into the Museum of Resistance, there's a big warehouse, and in the warehouse you have German armored personnel carriers, you have US artillery systems, you have the wreckage of a French fighter jet, you have the remnants of Israeli rockets and Israeli drones, you have landmines from across the NATO bloc, and so on and so forth. And this isn't an old story, because when I was there, one of the exhibits that they were showing was of a rocket that just 2 weeks prior had been launched at a civilian car, killing an entire family along the Western Saharan Algerian border. So this is current. And once again, we have a situation in which Morocco maintains an occupation that would not be possible but for the support of the collective West, which is embodied in NATO and represented by NATO. And to go back to the point that I started with, the reason I said that NATO is inseparable from the genocide in Gaza, because the same is true of Israel. Israel is armed, trained, funded, and diplomatically covered by pretty much all of the NATO member states, with few exceptions. And then those same states import the weapons that were tested on Palestinians to use elsewhere or on their own populations. And so NATO has to be part of the discussion about Palestine, just like it has to be part of the broader discussion about imperialism, because it's part of the same historical current and the same series of historical strategies that has taken us to where we are today. And maybe I'll leave it at that. I hope we can go back and get into some of these other points in more detail, but that's kind of what I wanted to get across today.
Okay, thank you, Pavel. Medea. Oh, we can't seem to hear you, so
Yes.
I'm thinking you might.
Okay, thank you.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And Powell, that was a great overview of the history of NATO and how it ties in to the efforts of the colonial powers to hold on to their colonies, and bringing it up to date on how Israel has been the testing ground for weapons that we see now with the autonomous weapons, with AI being used and tested on the people in Palestine. We know that that will be soon spread around all over where the Western powers have their militarism going on. And I wanted to talk a little about how, from a US perspective, first, Powell, you talked about how difficult it is to organize now because of the need to focus on Gaza. But here in the United States, it's always been difficult to focus and mobilize around NATO. And a lot of that is because in the US, there is very little understanding about what NATO is. There was a poll that came out just in February by Gallup that looked at what Americans think about NATO. And in that poll, it said that 47% of Americans want to keep the present level of US commitment to NATO. 20% of them wanted to increase it. And 28% said, well, maybe we should lessen a little bit or maybe even withdraw. Now, I would say it's not very dependable poll because most people, I think, don't have any idea what NATO is and what NATO does. But it is interesting that there was a huge difference between Democrats and Republicans, with Republicans much less in support of NATO. And that is because Trump has talked about NATO and said, Europeans, we're not going to defend them. They don't even pay their fair share. He didn't say Russia, but he meant Russia, do whatever they want to them. The attitude, which is very contradictory, that Trump has had. He's not really anti-NATO. He just wanted the Europeans to pay more. But that has had an impact among some Republicans, and some Republicans tend to be more libertarian or isolationist, or think that things like Ukraine are a European problem and should be dealt with by Europe. We shouldn't be spending billions of dollars. But my point is really how hard it is to organize because people really don't know about NATO in the United States. I think in Europe, there's much more awareness about that. And a lot of what the United States gets out of NATO is to have Europe go in with the United States on its adventures overseas. We see how NATO has followed the United States, whether it's intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and also how NATO is used by the United States to keep a independent European architecture, both political and military and economic, from coming into being. The NATO has been used to exercise economic influence, from dollar hegemony to international trade, including thwarting bilateral agreements between NATO members and the Soviet Union. And there have been leaked documents that showed how the Pentagon saw that U.S. military might in Europe was essential not just for stability in Europe, but for U.S. hegemony, and said we must, quote, discourage the advanced industrialized nations in Europe from challenging our leadership or even aspiring to a larger global or regional goal. And there are other generals in the U.S. who said that only a strong NATO with the U.S. centrally involved can prevent Western Europe from drifting into national parochialism and eventually regression from its present level of economic and political cooperation. And I also think it's very important to recognize how the U.S. Has used NATO to sell weapons. There is a lobby group that formed during the 90s to push for NATO expansion. It was called the U.S. Committee to Expand NATO. It was run by a vice president of Lockheed Martin. And there were nations like Romania that were told if they wanted to get into NATO, they had to make huge purchases of U.S. weapons. We see today with the inclusion of Finland and Sweden that those countries were being pushed into joining NATO by their weapons industries. The CEO of Saab, which makes fighter jets, talked about how joining NATO's inner circle would give them greater market access, and said that even now we see new contracts coming in because of our joining of NATO. And Finland also has a developed weapons industry that stands to gain from NATO inclusion, but also let's recognize that it was really the war in Ukraine that has led to a massive increase in European spending on NATO, something that the US has been pushing for. You know, there is this, quote, goal that was established in NATO back in 2006 and reiterated in 2014, that NATO countries should be spending 2% of their GDP on militarism. A disgusting kind of goal that tries to take money away from the social safety nets of the European countries and push it into the weapons, the military industrial complex. But it was the Russian invasion that made it easier to push the European countries. The US is already spending 3.5% of its GDP on weapons, on militarism. And so there has been this massive increase, which has been a boon for not only US weapons companies, but for Western European weapons companies as well. And a couple of other points I wanted to make is that while we talk about the 32 countries that are part of NATO, let's recognize that NATO is now a global behemoth, and it has these partnerships that span across the globe. They have partners across not only Northern Africa, but all of Africa, partners with Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, something called the Istanbul Cooperative Initiative with making partners throughout the Middle East. And then we have, as Pawan mentioned, and Luisa in the intro, this focus on China. The North Atlantic part of NATO means nothing anymore. The focus on China is something that the US has been pushing the NATO countries to go along with. And In their last meeting last year, they officially said that China was an adversary and have made the Australia, New Zealand, and Japan and Korea partners so that they could bulk up the NATO presence that is so provocative to China, including the two NATO members, the US and the UK, together with Australia, forming AUKUS, which will bring nuclear-powered submarines into the region, another huge provocation to China. So I want to just end by saying that it is great that Pawan recognized the history that some of the leaders in the anti-colonial movement, from Amilcar Cabral and Fidel Castro, seeing NATO as the behemoth that wanted to take over the world and destroy the chances of socialist countries to come into being and to thrive, that we still have today this even greater behemoth that is trying to stop those same things from going on, not only overseas, but within our own countries, and doing it in a way, at least in the United States, that keeps absolute lack of transparency, because most Americans have no idea how NATO functions, and violating even the UN Charter in its many interventions overseas. And as NATO members are meeting today and trying to get a pledge of $100 billion from NATO to pour into Ukraine to keep the war in Ukraine going, we see the divisions that are starting to crop up within NATO, not just Hungary saying, well, we don't know, we want to give this money, but other countries wondering if indeed they want to pledge tens of billions of dollars, and in this case, $100 billion to a war that Ukraine is losing. And here in the United States, there is growing opposition to the bill that President Biden introduced to get $60 billion more to Ukraine. And that was back in October. And we are still, to this day, the Congress has not been able to overcome the divisions to get this bill on the table. I think that's a positive thing. It shows not only a, quote, war fatigue, but a real questioning about how we want to spend our dollars, and whether NATO is really leading us down a path that could lead to World War III, could lead to nuclear war, and how can we stop it, which is why I'm very excited about the upcoming gathering that we're having in Washington, D.C. in July of NATO at its next summit, and how we can build to increase the awareness in the United States and, of course, around the world about how we have to educate and mobilize to try to destroy the tremendous power that NATO has, and eventually to see the dissolution of NATO that should have happened at the time the Warsaw Pact dissolved. Thank you.
Excellent. And thank you so much for plugging the conference. We already had a slide prepared, so that's absolutely perfect. So I have some questions for you both, and we do want to take some time for audience questions as well. So please get those ready, and you're welcome to put them in the chat. But Pavel, you talked a little bit about pivoting a little bit to the global South, right? You talked about how NATO has subverted left movements, anti-colonial struggles. And if you could, either one of you could talk about how the global South broadly has responded to the war in Ukraine, and what that says about why the response has been considerably less enthusiastic than the United States, but also what that says about who they might identify with, right? As countries that have been imperialized by sometimes multiple different colonial powers. I will say I'm asking this question as somebody who's from I was born in Chile. I think Chile's response has been exceptionally embarrassing, right? Boric has been very enthusiastic about supporting the war, but he's at the difference end, right? He's kind of the exception. So yeah, maybe Pablo, if you could go first, and then Medea.
Sure, it's in a sense it's a really simple question, but I'm a communist, so maybe I'll give a sweeping answer. If you read the manifesto that was written for the inaugural session of the Communist International, the Third International, was written by Leon Trotsky. It talks about how effectively the First World War, other than being a war for the division of the spoils of colonialism, absorbed into it people and armies from across the colonized world, right? So you had people from across Africa, from Asia, from huge swathes of the planet who were brought to Europe by the colonial powers and effectively forced to wage a war, not of their own making, and in the service of their own subjugation, right? Because the war was effectively for the division of their own countries. We saw the same thing in the Second World War. And really, one way of looking at the entirety of the Cold War is precisely as one giant battlefield in which the global South was gradually picked off to try to weaken, isolate and isolate the Soviet Union and prevent, as I said earlier, the spread of communism and socialism as an ideology, which meant in practice preventing any popular movement from coming to power. So you have a very long history, a very violent history. And maybe, you know, if we focus on the Cold War for a second, the term Cold War is extremely misleading because that war was incredibly hot for a tremendous number of people around the world. There's an estimate somewhere that if you tally up all the wars that the US has started, from Korea, you know, Vietnam, including a lot of the killings that happened in Guatemala and Indonesia, you come to over 20 million people, 20 million lives lost in the course of US anti-communist interventions in the post-Second World War period. That starts to resemble a hot war. So it was a hot war for some and a cold war for others. And I think that generated already back then a very powerful mood, a very powerful feeling that we need to move away from this system, which constantly drags us in to these conflicts to fight on behalf, again, of powers that are trying to colonize us and occupy us and chart a new path. And that was very difficult to do without some kind of process of integration. One example of that kind of, you know, a step that was taken by the countries of the global South, of the Third World, towards integrating was the Bandung Conference, the Conference of Afro-Asian Peoples in 1955, in which the Indian Prime Minister, looking at the way that NATO was funding Portugal to maintain its grip on various African colonies, called it one of the most powerful protectors of colonialism. So already then, in 1955, in the process of forming these new regional blocs that were meant to move the global South away from the dominance of colonial imperial powers, already then there was a very key recognition, a very clear recognition of NATO's core function. I think that persisted, and the reason it disappeared in some places is because popular governments and popular movements were deposed, destroyed, exterminated, and what was left were regimes that were very subordinate, and very pliant politically to the West. And that, of course, amplified after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a massive force for decolonization, right? Beyond providing material support, beyond providing ideological support, beyond building infrastructure, providing arms to various, you know, liberation fighters. The existence of another pole, the existence of the possibilities of trading on terms different than those that were offered by the, you know, World Trade Organization at some point, but the IMF, the World Bank, and the general kind of Washington consensus was a very powerful driver of, if not, you know, socialist revolution, then at least sovereign construction across the global South. So there was a period of defeat. And in that period of defeat, everyone started to kind of accept, okay, well, NATO's just a thing. It's inevitable. There's nothing we can do against it. It's expanding. I think, the third world didn't have much of a stake in it for a long time. Of course, with the exception of the countries that were destroyed by NATO member states in that time. We forget about the Gulf Wars in the early 1990s. We forget about all the wars that Israel has waged against its neighbors with US backing. Of course, then Yugoslavia, then Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and so on. Through these conflicts and through the imposition of a kind of US mandate on the world, this was the US saying, you will behave as we want you to behave or else. We have the capacity to destroy nations, to literally destroy nations, to turn the most prosperous nation in Africa into one that hosts open-air slave markets. And not only that, that generates radical tendencies, radical Islamist tendencies, for example, in the wider region, generates political fragility, which again makes it easier for the collective West, as Samir Amin called it, to extract the resources of these countries. And so those ambitions never went away, but the capacities of states to organize against them have reemerged recently. And I think what we're seeing through, first of all, the shift in the balance of trade towards China and the existence of really powerful development institutions, including the Chinese Development Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, among many others. These are opening pathways to development that, while certainly not ideal, are different than those that were on offer from the US and Western Europe, broadly speaking. You see increasing regional integration, which doesn't seek to compete with the US or NATO, but it tries to find solutions to local problems. You see this in Latin America. You see this to a lesser extent in Africa. You see this to a maybe greater extent in Asia. And we're seeing the reemergence of this politics of non-alignment, saying, okay, well, again, we have Europe trying to suck us into a conflict not of our own making. Not only that, but this has been the tendency that, we felt this on our skin for the past century, and we're not going to fall for it again. And I think that's a very simple impulse, but it's grounded in A, a very extensive historical experience of exploitation, and B, a changing balance of power in the international system, which is opening up spaces for global South countries to express themselves again.
So if I can follow up on that sweeping, wonderful, brilliant look, Powell, I'm just going to take it to what's happening today, which is when the US has tried to get the support of the global South for condemning Russia. It has time and time again found itself wondering, why won't these countries vote with us? Why don't we have the power anymore to strong arm them like we used to do in the past, so that they will go along with us? Well, the US doesn't have that kind of economic leverage anymore. And we see how the relations and trade that you talked about with China and Russia mean that at the United Nations, most countries in the global South refuse to go along with the United States in condemning Russia. Not that they didn't condemn Russia, but they didn't want to follow the US in imposing sanctions on Russia because they felt that the US is so hypocritical, and the West in general is so hypocritical. And we see that, of course, today with the US and Western support of Israel, how they've just made an incredible mockery of this idea of a rules-based order. Of course, it's been a mockery all along, but now you can see it in full sight. And so countries of the global South, in the case of Ukraine, were more interested in trying to find a solution. So it was quite astounding to see, Luisa, while it wasn't coming from Chile, there were initiatives coming from Mexico, coming from Colombia, coming from Honduras, coming from 6 nations in Africa, and of course coming from China as well, to try to say, let's find a negotiated solution to the problem in Ukraine. And the US and the UK, with the rest of Europe then following along behind vis-a-vis NATO, said, no, we want Ukraine to keep fighting. And then when you see how the nations of the global South have gotten behind Gaza and calling for a ceasefire and daring to challenge Israel and the United States, you see it most directly in South Africa bringing Israel before the International Court of Justice, something that most nations of the global South applauded, as well as did most people around the world. But since I spend my days every day in Congress, I would want to tell you that there is a piece of legislation introduced bipartisan, that means Democrats and Republicans, to say, how dare South Africa? Three things. One, have close relations with China, have good relations with Russia, and have brought Israel before the International Court of Justice. And so for that, we must reassess our relationship with South Africa. The US has not reassessed its relationship with the genocidal regime of Israel, but wants to reassess the relationship with Africa. And I say this just to say that what Powell has been talking about historically is, of course, happening today, but the US is less able to get its ducks in a row and have countries like South Africa, like Colombia, like Mexico, etc., just follow behind the United States. In fact, they are challenging the US and Israel.
So I'm going to kind of merge some of these questions. We got two questions left. So one is, and I think it's around the same theme. It's kind of, these are rhetorical questions. Is it worth risking Ukraine's sovereigns to have the USA withdraw from NATO? I understand NATO is to the Gaza Strip. Oh, how dangerous NATO is to the Gaza Strip. However, is it worth definitively losing one country's independence to partially help another? And then another question is, what's the best reply to people who try to make the question of NATO a binary choice between Putin's authoritarianism and the rest of the world? And they're kind of the same, it's kind of both within the tone of this choice, this false choice that we're presented. So Pavel, maybe, I don't know if you want to respond to that first.
I can. I think actually they're distinct questions, and maybe I'll start with the second. As long as empires have existed, there's been the idea, the fallacy of the barbarian at the gate. That if only we stop fighting this war, the floodgates will open, and the barbarians will, eat our children and steal our women and so on. This is the oldest story in the book. This is what they say about Hamas. You have European leaders openly saying that if Israel doesn't, finish its genocide in Gaza, we're going to have radical Islam in Europe. Completely insane notions. It's exactly the same rhetoric that was used in the context of Soviet expansionism, and it's exactly the same rhetoric that's used about Russia now. Now, whatever we think about what's happening, I don't see any incentive or capacity for Russia to want to export its political model very far. And I think this idea, this fear and this fear, by the way, has been used against all kinds of countries, big and small. Pay attention to it, because you'll find it quite ridiculous when you hear it enough times about enough countries. But it's part of a process of trying to stir up fear in order to justify more arms production and the continuation of war. So I don't really buy into that argument. The question on Ukrainian sovereignty is very important. Do I think it's worth it? No, I absolutely don't think it's worth it, but I think it's very important to identify the point at which sovereignty was lost, right? We have on record leaked recordings of the US government, Victoria Nuland specifically, appointing senior members of the Ukrainian government and vetoing certain members of the Ukrainian government when they didn't like the choice. We have very clear evidence of deep control by the US and various US agencies of processes within the Ukrainian state. We have evidence of massive privatization, the destruction of labor rights, the sell-off of huge sectors of the economy to US capital, to BlackRock, to Goldman Sachs, to massive investment funds. So what do we mean when we talk about sovereignty? Right? I think the situation that we found ourselves in, and in fact, I think Ukraine probably is the clearest example of a neo-colonized state that we'd seen in Europe for a very long time, because every trick in the book was used, right? Tons of resources sold to the US, direct appointments of political candidates. This stuff used to happen in the global South. And so you have a state, an effective kind of effectively controlled or puppeteered from Washington, which has a massive border with the US's primary adversary. It was bound to be explosive. And do I think the sacrifice of, especially the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives and the sacrifice of the sovereignty of a country was worth it? Absolutely not. But I think that sacrifice was determined long before February of 2022.
Well, let me add to that how the US and the UK took the lead, and with some reluctance from France and Germany, but then they fell back in line, of squashing the very good possibility of a negotiated solution in Ukraine just 1 month after the Russian invasion, where both sides were willing to make compromises, and the compromise on the part of Ukraine was that it would agree not to join NATO. It would be a neutral country. And the UK intervention of saying, no, we will not support that, US coming right in behind saying we must use this as an opportunity to weaken Russia, has led to this bloodbath and a war of attrition that has been going on now, and shows no end in sight. In fact, shows the possibility of a more regional war. We know what the contours of a diplomatic solution are because we saw them in April of 2002. We need to get back to the negotiating table. Ukraine will still be a sovereign country. Yes, it won't have parts of the Donbass and Crimea, which are places with predominantly Russian-speaking and ethnic Russians. But it will indeed be a sovereign country and will probably have some kind of fast track into the European Union. The important thing is how to get the players to the negotiating table, and I think those of us who live in the West, and especially here in the United States, is to say, stop fueling this war with so many billions of dollars, and instead push Zelensky, while others can push Putin to the negotiating table. And I think this also brings, I'd like to bring in one issue in this, which is I think that the opposition to Israel's genocide in Gaza is resulting in an incredible grassroots movement around the world, and even in the wealthy countries with very strong military-industrial complexes that could help us in the fight against NATO. Because as we see countries that are being forced now to say we won't send any more weapons to Israel, European countries, Canada, the big division that's happening in the UK right now, this is quite an amazing challenge to these huge weapons industries that we have not seen before. So I feel like if we keep this going, if we keep challenging the sale of weapons to that violate international law, we can be building up a movement that can also challenge the the sale of weapons around the world to especially to some of the most repressive regimes that NATO has been involved in propping up. So this could be one very, very tiny silver lining in the horrific tragedy of Gaza.
That's actually a great lead in to some of the other questions that we have. So beyond protest rallies, what strategies can we employ to resist NATO expansion? What historically has been effective, particularly as for those of us who live in the imperial core, as I like to say, the largest terrorist state in the world?
So I'll give that a shot. I wonder if I could also suggest that we at some point touch on the nuclear question, because I think that's really important, and I think it's not talked about enough, and it's a very key factor in all these things. So we can turn back to that. You know, looking at the imperial core, really, what has been effective? Substantively nothing. NATO's expanded. NATO's expanded as far as it can possibly go. But thinking a little bit, you know, taking the question seriously, what's been most effective in preventing NATO from, you know, its various designs in different parts of the world has been resistance against it in those parts of the world, right? It was ultimately the people of Mozambique and Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau and Angola that won their own independence from a NATO member state. And what was critical for people living in the imperial core at the time was to build bonds of solidarity in whatever ways they could with those movements of resistance. In fact, Portugal had its own revolution, the Carnation Revolution in the 1970s, which finally deposed the fascist dictatorship that had been in power for many, many years. And that was sparked by solidarity with the anti-colonial forces in the colonies. And I think it's very important to remember that in the context of a political environment where the left is still expected, you know, is expected to celebrate dead Palestinians, but not the living and resisting Palestinians, is expected to condemn Palestinian resistance, even if we, you know, express our sympathies to the victims of the genocide. I don't think that's the right approach. I think if you are finding yourself on the receiving end of the kind of violence that we are seeing, then it is rational to take up arms and fight back. And it's rational, as the Yemenis are doing, the Ansar Allah movement are doing, to try to blockade the arteries of global capitalism in whatever way they can to prevent that war machine from being fed. And I think it's incredibly important at this time for us to try to forge solidarities with those movements that are on the front line, because we are actually fighting one struggle. They might be on the front lines of it, but we're at its rear. Now, what forms of activism might work? You know, it really depends on the context. I think any kind of protest, especially the kind of protest movement that we're seeing form now around Palestine, will create its own leaders and will create its own organizations. And it's essential that we use this moment to strengthen those organizations, to institutionalize and to build real political power that's durable, that continues beyond the protest. We're also seeing the emergence of new strategies of direct action, you know, Palestine action, blockading and dismantling the factories that supply Israel's war machine. They recently shut down the third factory in the UK, their third factory that their activism has shut down, which is an incredible achievement. We're seeing the Greek communist movement actively in the ports and on the railways blockading NATO ships, NATO, you know, trains and ships and supplies going to various parts of the world. And in fact, I'll plug a Global Day of Action. There is a proposal on the table on the 15th of April, which I think is your tax day in the US, for a global day of rage, they call it, a day of global disruption, which shuts down key economic arteries in big cities and also in shuts down companies that are complicit. And I think money talks, right? So those two things, building our infrastructures, building our organizations, refining our strategies, trying a diversity of tactics, but also building real solidarity with those movements that are on the front line, I think are what's going to make the difference in the end.
Well, that's beautiful. I totally am inspired by what you say, Powell, because I see it happening. I also see the merging of movements that we've been hoping for years and years and years, and is now happening around the struggle for Palestine. For example, we've had the hardest time getting environmental groups to care about war, to join us in saying, let's find a way to end the ecocide happening in Ukraine by ending that war. Let's fight the military budget so that we can put hundreds of millions of dollars into addressing the climate crisis. And we couldn't get them. And now suddenly we're seeing joint actions between environmentalists and those of us who consider ourselves anti-war activists, but are also environmentalists, but coming together around this issue of how do we stop the genocide, and creating relationships that I think will last because we're educating each other. We've talked for so long about how we need to educate other movements about spending now about $1 trillion in the United States on militarism is not good if we ever want to have a national health care system, if we ever want to have free college education, if we ever want to have money to address the climate. But now I do see more of those movements coming into the fold to recognize that for example, the $95 billion supplemental that Biden was trying to pass, which was money for Israel, Ukraine, and the Indo-Pacific, is something that we have so far managed to stop passing in the Congress because there is a lot of internal political division, but also because people just don't see why we should be spending that much money on wars overseas when we have such amazing, huge problems here in our own communities. So I'm hoping that these kinds of cross-cultural, cross-issue, intersectional movement that we're really building right now will last. The other thing I'd like to say is that I think there is a major movement in the United States to show the effect of dirty money in our politics. And one of those is the pro-Israel lobby. But it's also the weapons industry that has more lobbyists than there are members of Congress. And so while there is a very strong movement that is being built up now to show how AIPAC money is having such a negative influence on our electoral system, trying to take out progressives who are not just progressive or saying Palestinians should have some rights, mild statements, but our progressives in other issues like domestic issues. We see this pro-Israel money being poured in to try to eliminate them from Congress, try to support alternatives to them. And I think that if we can show the connection between this pro-Israel lobby and the weapons industry, we might be able to build up a stronger movement to show how dirty money in politics has really skewed our electoral system so much that the people who are supposed to represent us, the vast majority of them, have absolutely failed us and do not represent the best interests of the people of this country, much less the people around the world.
Excellent. I'm just going to go ahead and take the opportunity to again promote this conference, No to NATO, Yes to Peace. So every year, NATO has a summit with all the member countries, the presidents, the prime ministers get together and they talk about war. They set the agenda for the year. And so that will be in DC, July 9 through 10. And so we're going to have No to NATO, Yes to Peace counter summit the week before that. DSA International Committee will be co-sponsoring along with a number of other organizations, including, of course, Code Pink, World Beyond War, Vets for Peace, and many others. So please join us. Check out the website, no NATO no NATO yespeace.org for more information. You'll be able to find other resources as well. And have your group affiliate, become a sponsor. It's an open invitation. We want as many groups as possible. And there's still plenty of time to have input on how the events will be organized. The conference will be at George Washington University on Saturday, and exact times are still being developed. And then on the following day, on July 7th, there'll be a rally outside the White House in Lafayette Square Park. So everybody's encouraged to come. And if you're an activist or in a DSA branch close to DC, you are very much encouraged to organize a bus and take your comrades to the rally. And as always, if you're a DSA member, you can get involved by joining the International Committee. And also please look into following the tremendous work of Code Pink and Progressive International. What they do day in, day out is always very impressive. So thank you again, Powell and Medea, for joining us. And I can't thank you enough. You got a world to win.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
I was ready to keep going, so.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.